Okay, it's now 6 p.m., so let's go ahead and get started. If you're just joining us, good evening and welcome to the EPA's virtual public information session for the Paden City PCE site. Again, my name is Meg Broughton and I am your Community Involvement Coordinator for the site. I will be facilitating our session tonight, which will include some brief presentations from several agencies involved in the Paden City PCE site. These include the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and the Environmental Protection Agency. We also have representatives from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection online to answer questions. Following the presentation portion, we will have a question and answer session. Again, if you are having issues, any kind of technical issues or issues hearing the audio from your computer, please go ahead and type into the Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen or call Fabio at the number listed in the first paragraph of our text box. Unfortunately, due to health concerns, we had to make this an online-only meeting, which comes with its own set of challenges. We are new to the technologies we're using tonight, so we appreciate your patience if we encounter any technical issues, and we thank you in advance. Since this is our first attempt with these technologies, we're certainly open to feedback, and we are committed to finding a way to communicate with the Paden City community that works for you. So to kick things off, you'll notice that this meeting is using the Adobe Connect platform. It may be new to many of you, but if you're hearing my voice and you're seeing a screen with several boxes in front of you, you're in the right place. I want to first direct your attention to the bottom of the screen to the box that is labeled LiveCaption. As you can see, we have a live captioner who is typing what I am saying into the box in case you have trouble hearing or are hearing impaired. Second, since we have speakers from several different agencies tonight, we have a little box in the top left corner labeled Now Speaking so that you can easily figure out which agency is presenting information at the time. I know that I personally would rather be in person with you tonight and speaking face-to-face, but this is the best option we have at this point. Third, I'd like to direct your attention to the box labeled Q&A on the bottom left side of your screen. You can feel free to type questions into the Q&A box at any time and click Enter to send it. Your question won't be seen by all participants, but all of us presenters can see your question when it comes in. When we reach the question and answer portion of tonight's session, we will be addressing the questions verbally in the order they were received. We will not read your name out loud in association with the question unless you give us explicit permission to do so. If you want us to read your name out loud, you can type, "Please read my name out loud" at the end of your question. If we see similar questions coming in, we will group them together and try to answer them all at once. Or if we feel that your question has already been answered, we will skip it. And please know that we do have a list of the questions that were submitted during the registration process. We tried our best to cover those in the presentations we have this evening. If we get to the end of the presentation portion and you feel that your question was not answered, please feel free to go ahead and add it to the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer your questions in the time allotted. Please consider starting by asking only one question at a time so that we can answer as many people's questions as possible in the time that we have tonight. Next slide. Now, the purpose of tonight's meeting is for the community to hear from the agencies that are involved in responding to this issue in Paden City, and for you as a community to be able to ask questions. Again, I want you to feel free to type questions in at any time, but note that our presentation portion may answer some of your questions. And please remember that our dialogue with this community doesn't end at 7:30 tonight. You can feel free to contact me, the Community Involvement Coordinator, at any time with questions about the site. Next slide. Now, the purpose of tonight's meeting is for the community to hear from the agencies that are involved in responding to this issue in Paden City, and for you as a community to be able to ask questions. Again, I want you to feel free to type questions in at any time, but note that our presentation portion may answer some of your questions. And please remember that our dialogue with this community doesn't end at 7:30 tonight. You can feel free to contact me, the Community Involvement Coordinator, at any time with questions about the site. So before we launch into the presentation portion of tonight, I just want to introduce who is here tonight and talk a little bit about how our roles are different in Paden City. I know this is a lot of information, but I'll try to be as clear as possible. First, we have the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources Bureau for Public Health. The Bureau for Public Health has primacy for the implementation of the Safe Drinking Water Act in West Virginia. What this means is that EPA has delegated the responsibility for implementing the Safe Drinking Water Act to the Bureau for Public Health. They are responsible for primary enforcement for public water systems such as Paden City in West Virginia. Tonight's speaker from the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources is Meredith Vance. Next, we have the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, or the West Virginia DEP. The Department of Environmental Protection has requested EPA's assistance in investigating the source of PCE in Paden City, and now they are serving in a supporting role to EPA. Although we will not be having a presentation from them tonight, they are here with us and ready to answer any questions directed at them. From DEP, we have Casey Corbini and Bill Huggins joining us tonight. Also joining us tonight are representatives from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. Since it's such a long name, I'll just refer to it from here on out as ATSDR. ATSDR is a federal agency and is a sister agency to the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. They provide public health assessments for communities like Paden City. Our representative tonight from ATSDR is Laura Werner. Lastly, we have the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, where I work. Our regional office is based in Philadelphia. We have several representatives here from EPA tonight, and you will hear more about our assessment and investigation work. So tonight, you'll primarily hear from Connor O'Loughlin, who is our site assessment manager, but we also have Dennis Matlock, on-scene coordinator for Paden City, online as well to answer questions. Next slide. So tonight's session is going to look a little bit like this. First, we're going to hear from the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources about Paden City's drinking water. Then ATSDR about their public health evaluation. And we will round out the presentation portion with the US EPA. After the presentation portion, we will move on to the Q&A session. Next slide. Now, Meredith Vance of West Virginia's Department of Health and Human Resources will start off the presentation portion for this evening's session. Thanks.
Good evening. This is Meredith Vance with the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources, Bureau for Public Health. I'm the Acting Director for the Environmental Engineering Division. Our division regulates public drinking water systems and enforces compliance under the Safe Drinking Water Act. The Safe Drinking Water Act requires all community public water systems to sample for around 90 contaminants. Testing frequency varies based on the system's source of water and population, as well as sampling results. So as you may know, Paden City's drinking water wells have been contaminated with perchloroethylene, or PCE. This chemical is commonly used in the dry cleaning process. It is highly soluble and very stable in water. PCE was first detected in Paden City drinking water in 2010. In 2018, after levels began to increase, the state began working with the system to determine best solutions. The water system had previously installed 3 air stripper units in the early 2000s. The air stripper units will remove the PCE and likely did aid in the removal of the PCE from the time period between 2010 and 2018. However, in 2018, one of the 3 air stripper units failed and was unrepairable, which led to an increase in the PCE levels. The water system first exceeded the drinking water standard for PCE during the 4th quarter of 2018. Then in the fall of 2019, a 2nd air stripper unit failed, leading to even higher results in November and December. The unit was repaired in early 2020, reducing the PCE levels. Next slide, please. The new treatment plant, which is a larger air stripper unit with 6 trays for redundancy, was placed online on May the 8th of 2020. The use of the air strippers to remove volatile chemicals such as PCE is known to be extremely effective. The sample results from May 11, 2020, which were collected after the new treatment plant was placed online, show that PCE was not detected in the treated water leaving the new plant. In an effort to closely monitor the water system, PCE samples will continue to be collected monthly for the next year and at a minimum of every quarter indefinitely. The Safe Drinking Water Act requires Paden City to monitor quarterly for PCE at the point where the water is leaving the treatment plant. Paden City has also been collecting raw samples from each of their wells, along with several samples out in the distribution system around town. Compliance for drinking water standards is calculated on a running annual average of only the results collected from the treatment plant after treatment. A running annual average is the average of sample results collected from the treatment plant during the current quarter and the 3 previous quarters. The system is in violation if the average exceeds the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, of 5 micrograms per liter or parts per billion. Given this calculation for compliance, the system will continue to exceed the MCL and receive violations for at least the current quarter and the next quarter, which ends September 30th of 2020, and possibly the last quarter. So even though the current results show that PCE was not detected in the water, the system is going to continue to receive violations because of the average. Next slide, please. The levels of PCE in the drinking water were not considered an immediate health risk because of the MCL of 5 parts per billion is based on a lifetime exposure. A lifetime exposure is based on a person drinking 2 liters of water per day for 70 years at PCE levels above 5 parts per billion may have an increased risk of potential health effects. The MCL is the enforceable level under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Paden City has never exceeded the EPA's daily health advisory for PCE of 2,000 parts per billion, which would have been considered an immediate health risk. EPA also has a lifetime health advisory set at 10 parts per billion for PCE. To date, the highest result collected from the treatment plant is 21 parts per billion from November 2019, and the highest compliance average used to determine if the system is in violation was 13 parts per billion from the first quarter of 2020. If PCE or any other primary contaminant is detected in your drinking water and the average is below the MCL, Paden City is required to report those levels in the annual Consumer Confidence Report, which is required to be made available to the community prior to July 1st for the previous year's sample results. You can contact your water system to obtain a copy of this annual report. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. And as a reminder, if you have questions for Meredith based on what she just presented, you can feel free to type those into the chat now or wait until the question and answer session. Now we have Laura Werner of the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry.
Thank you, Meg and Meredith. Like Meg just said, my name is Laura. EPA asked my agency, the one with the really long name, ATSDR, to speak tonight to share a little information on how public health officials try to determine if an environmental exposure has caused health effects in a community. And we call this process public health assessment. Next slide, please. Meg already mentioned this, but ATSDR is a federal public health agency, and we're a sister agency to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're headquartered in Atlanta, and we have 6 scientists that sit in a small Region 3 office, co-located with EPA Region 3 in Philadelphia. So when I'm not working at home, like we are now, I sit in the same building as Megan and Connor who are on the phone with you tonight from EPA. And again, we're advisory, we're non-regulatory, but we try to give advice and recommendations to partner agencies at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as directly to community members and health professionals about what it means to have had an exposure to a harmful chemical. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about exposure pathways, because that's really key to our understanding about whether health effects could be likely. We know that community members here in Paden City who use the public water supply were exposed to PCE in their drinking water. And you were exposed in all the ways that you use drinking water. Drinking, cooking, washing clothes, showering, bathing, all of those things. So we consider that a confirmed or completed exposure pathway. We know, like Meredith just described, that it was in various levels in the system for around 10 years. And that's important because how much and how long are important determining factors in trying to understand what that exposure means. One of the things we don't know is what level of PCE you actually had at your point of use, or in other words, the concentration of the chemical that was there at the tap at your house or where you work or go to school. We make estimates about that based on what we saw in the water coming from the treatment plant. The maximum level that was in raw water before it was treated or blended was around 50 parts per billion. But then, as Meredith said, the maximum level that we're seeing going out to community members was 21 parts per billion. Based on your situation and what we know about those levels, these do not seem high enough to have actually caused health effects for community members. So that's the good news. Again, we have to caution that there's a lot we don't know, but from what we do know, that's what we conclude. This is a preliminary assessment based on information that we have now. So again, that's all about the drinking water pathway. Another pathway that we're interested in is called the vapor intrusion pathway, and that is when PCE in the underground can accumulate in the indoor air of buildings or directly over sources of contamination. So it's not widespread that everybody who got drinking water, but this is for people in buildings that are close by to where the contamination occurred. And Connor's going to talk a lot more about that next. Again, we consider that a potential exposure pathway right now. We need more information. And that's one of the important things that EPA is doing here in your community. I know we often get a lot of questions on the health agency side. Why are you focusing on environmental sampling information to make your public health decision? Why aren't you looking at our diseases and our symptoms? And the reason we do that is because diseases and symptoms are not specific to the exposure. For example, a person, you can imagine, could experience dizziness or headache. And those are symptoms that could occur after you've had breathing exposure to very high levels of PCE. But you can also predict that there might be a lot of reasons why a person might have those kinds of symptoms. And that can be true for more serious illness outcomes as well. We often have very limited information about diseases and symptoms in the community, and even when it's collected, it's usually extremely hard to verify that information and conclusively link them with any environmental exposure of concern. So we really try to limit our evaluation in those cases to looking at that kind of health outcome data, we call it, to when we think there's a special need or we really need that to get additional information. Okay, that's my part. And like Meredith said, I'm happy to address further questions for me during the Q&A portion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Again, please continue typing your questions into the Q&A. We see a couple coming in, so thank you for those. Our final speaker for the presentation portion of this evening is Connor O'Loughlin, Site Assessment Manager for the U.S. EPA.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you for everyone for participating in the site meeting for Paden City Groundwater Plume. My name is Connor O'Loughlin. Next slide. This evening I'll be sharing some of the details of the site, ongoing removal and site inspection assessments, and the adjacent areas where contamination exists. EPA and West Virginia have been in cooperation with each other in order to identify facilities and sources of the contamination in the area. In 2018, West Virginia, DEP, and Paden City requested EPA's assistance with the identification of the sources of the contamination within the public wells. 2018 to present, EPA's removal program conducted an assessment of the bandbox dry cleaning facility and the potential areas of concern where vapor intrusion may exist. The state of West Virginia, Department of Environmental Protection, and EPA have been using their authorities to investigate the site and has requested EPA to provide support to assess, investigate, and provide technical resources for the investigation activities. A time-critical removal action was started in 2018. EPA's removal group, who's Dennis Matlock, who is the on-scene coordinator, completed the soil groundwater monitoring, some vapor assessment to assess issues surrounding the bandbox facility. Removal actions are immediate short-term responses that are intended to protect people from immediate threats posed by the hazardous waste sites. The removal assessment is operating concurrently with the site inspection and West Virginia DEP's actions as well. January in 2020, EPA site assessment, myself, started assessing the site. 3 former dry cleaning facilities were identified in a total, and bandbox is the main location that we started with, as potential sources. 4 public wells were impacted. 1 of those wells was decommissioned and is currently unused. EPA, during our initial Phase 1 SI, drilled 8 observation wells and collected 16 soil samples. The data from the first phase of the SI were collected this month and are still pending. The primary objective of this SI was to identify sites that have the high probability of exhibiting contamination. I wanted to note that the SI collects limited information that would show if there is contamination released to the environment. It does not give a complete picture of the nature and extent of contamination. Those locations would be investigated during later phases of work. February 2020 to present, we conducted the Phase 1 inspection. Phase 2 will be ongoing later this summer. Next slide. So this is a site map of the 3 dry cleaning facilities in red squares. As noted in the previous slide, the 3 dry cleaning facilities previously operated in Paden City. EPA's removal and site assessment have conducted a coordinated response to identify the contamination in the town. The West Virginia DEP requested EPA conduct the assessment of the 1 dry cleaning facility in 2018. EPA's OSC conducted the assessment of the commercial, business, and residential areas in Paden City that were thought to have PCE in soil, soil vapor, and groundwater. EPA suspects multiple commingled groundwater plumes containing PCE and other hazardous compounds impacting the 3 active sole source municipal drinking water wells. The water company is a city-operated public company, as we all have heard, and the routine sampling have shown exceedances in the raw water from the public water wells. The extent of the groundwater plumes is not fully understood or delineated currently. The city water company has the 3 wells and 1 well that is no longer in use in the area. The aquifer unit in this area is highly productive, called a sole source aquifer, and has a drinking water geological unit that serves the town. The geological materials are of alluvial in origin and consist of sands, gravels, and silts. They comprise typical alluvial porous sedimentary layers. The flow of contamination will follow these porous zones to the public wells several thousand feet away from the dry cleaning facilities. Groundwater in this map flows from southeast to northwest. Next slide. So this is a typical graphic that represents what vapor intrusion may look like at certain sites. When dry cleaning chemicals, petroleum products, or other organic compounds are spilled on the ground and leak from underground tanks, they can give off gases or vapors and seep into buildings through the basement. The vapors move through the soil and seep through cracks in basement, foundations, sewer lines, other openings, vents. Vapor intrusion is a concern because the vapors can build up to a point where the health of residents or workers in those buildings could be at risk. PCE contamination from the bandbox dry cleaning facility was most likely deposited onto the ground surface near the back of the building where the highest concentrations have been detected. PCE is a dense liquid and tends to flow downward into the groundwater due to percolation by rainwater and gravity. PCA has been found in the subsurface at concentrations at 1.9% and is depicted in the dark black in the graphic. This is called the source. Those areas that are closest to the source have potentially higher chances of having detection as vapor in buildings. The concentrations in groundwater downgraded nearby, as depicted in light gray, was found to be 4,700 ppb in 2018 at a depth of 21 feet and north of the bandbox facility. These high levels of contamination can be a concern when PCE becomes a vapor and enters buildings to prevent sump or cracks in the basement. As part of EPA's Phase 2 assessment, EPA will be reaching out to locations that may have potential VI risk. If you have a concern about your home, please feel free to reach out to me or the Greater Site team. The contact information is at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So I'd like to go through some of the current sampling results from the removal assessment that was conducted in 2018 to present. Monitoring wells at the bandbox dry cleaners were sampled in 2018. PCE was identified in wells with concentrations as high as 4,700 parts per billion. PCA was identified in the subsurface soils with concentrations as high as 1.9% for PCE. 3 public wells were sampled in 2018. PCE was identified in all 3 wells with concentrations as high as 21 ppb, as we heard in previous slides. Vapor intrusion samples were completed in June 2020, and EPA is currently evaluating the data. As part of EPA's removal assessment in 2018, samples were collected from the subsurface soil, groundwater monitoring wells, 4 drinking water wells, and a well at a local industrial facility. EPA's removal assessment identified the bandbox cleaner as the primary source area around that former area as its primary source. Currently, EPA's site inspection activities are still ongoing. Samples from Phase 1 have been collected and submitted to the laboratory. However, EPA has not received the results currently. Next slide. So this is our site inspection map that we followed. Phase 1 included installation of the 8 monitoring wells. So the bandbox facility sits towards the western side, and it has the majority of the white arrows coming out of it. It's a relatively small facility. It includes, so during our Phase 1 investigation, EPA installed 8 monitoring wells. EPA installed wells at background locations as well, upgrading from the bandbox cleaner in the shallow and deep intervals. EPA installed wells surrounding the bandbox cleaner and 2 wells in the parking lot between the public wells and the bandbox cleaner in the high school parking lot. EPA's intent was to place wells in areas to determine those potential extent of contamination in the subsurface. While installing the 8 wells, EPA collected soil samples from the same wells in the shallow soils, 0 to 2 feet, and subsurface soils 2 to 6 feet below ground. EPA collected these soils to assist in the full assessment of the contamination in the soil, groundwater, potential vapors migrating into buildings. During Phase 1, the removal program installed vapor points at 2 other suspected dry cleaning facilities to determine if risk is present. EPA's Phase 2 assessment will begin in August or September of this year. PCE contamination plume in Paden City encompasses those areas that have become affected due to the contamination. The extent of the plume includes areas of the former bandbox cleaner, the 4 public wells, and the single industrial well. The plume was also identified within the soil vapor below 1 commercial space and a residential space nearby the bandbox cleaner. The plume area may also include 2 additional former dry cleaners. However, the investigation has not been fully completed to date. The entire plume area has a total area of roughly 63 acres and extends to a depth of the deepest affected public well, which is roughly 90 feet. The geological materials within the used portion of the aquifer are highly permeable, as I mentioned before, and therefore contamination readily can flow through the geological formation. The full extent and breadth of the plume will not be fully known until additional investigation activities have been completed. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show what the drilling activities look like, and it's pretty small footprint. The Phase 1 site inspection was conducted during June of this year. These are typical site photos. You might recognize them. The one on the left is within the school parking lot. The photo was one of the wells drilled in the parking lot between the cleaner and the school. The well was drilled to a depth of 59 feet. The well was installed using what's called sonic rotary drill rig. These rigs are highly efficient in these sedimentary geological materials. The photo on the right is during the drilling activities while installing the background location. It's a well up gradient to the south from the dry cleaners. Next slide. So I'd like to go into some of the next steps that EPA will be pursuing. July 2020, Phase 2 of the site investigation. EPA will install additional monitoring wells, add additional, and within those monitoring wells, we'll collect soil points as well. Sample the 4 impacted public wells, continue vapor intrusion investigation. The site inspection is currently ongoing. I will continue to investigate the 2 other potential facilities and a portion of the groundwater plume between the public wells and the dry cleaning facilities during Phase 2. The exact amount of time needed to assess the cleanup and to assess the investigation in the site depends on the amount of time it takes to determine the extent of the plume and understand the hydrology of the aquifer a little bit during the site inspection and potentially subsequent phases. Please note that during the site inspection and subsequent phases, the drinking water treatment of the public wells will continue as long as needed to ensure the public is protected. As an ongoing assessment for Phase 2, EPA will investigate the 2 additional facilities, the groundwater plume and soils that have been affected in the nearby commercial and residential areas away from the bandbox cleaner. The exact amount of time to complete the inspection is dependent on the following best scientific methods to complete the site assessment in order to protect human health and the environment. EPA will continue to work with our state and local partners to determine those best future response actions. I will now ask my colleague Megan to discuss the various community resources available to the public during the future activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connor. And I know we got a little bit of feedback that that was a lot of information, and I know it's a lot to absorb for folks. So I just want to remind you that if there's anything in particular that you missed and you'd like Connor to cover again, please go ahead and enter that into the chat box. And then also remember that this is being recorded and will be available after the meeting in a few days on the website. So if you did miss something or want to go back and check some details, that will be available to you. And I just want to, before we go into the Q&A session, before I discuss my piece, I want to thank all of our speakers tonight for tuning in from their prospective homes to share with all of us tonight. Also, I want to remind folks about our website where you can find more information about the Paden City PCE site and what EPA is doing at the site. And that is at the link listed on the slide. And just a reminder, if you'd like to be on an email list to receive information about the site, you can send an email to my email address, which is keegan.megan@epa.gov. So just because you subscribe or registered for this information session doesn't mean that I can automatically opt you in to receive emails from me. So I do need you to go ahead and send me an email if you'd like to be on that e-list. Most importantly, I want the community of Paden City to know that I have an open door, or rather an open voicemail box and email inbox at the moment. I'm here to be a resource for you, so please call or email me if you have any questions about the site. As I said, our dialogue does not end at 7:30 tonight, it's just beginning. And if it's not a question for EPA, I can help direct you to the right agency. Next slide. And here, as you can see, we have listed all the contact info for our speakers. And I believe that the email address for Laura is incorrect. So I'm going to have her go ahead and tune in and correct that for us. Laura?
It's LKW9, so it's just the W and the K were reversed. So LKW9 at cdc.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Sorry about that. And I will make sure that these contacts get onto our website as well. Next slide. So now we're going to start this evening's question and answer session. Remember that you can type questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and click enter. We're going to answer the questions in the order that they were received and try to group together similar questions. I see we do have a healthy number of questions here to get started on, so I'm excited. Remember that your questions can't be seen by other participants, but can be seen by our presenters. I won't read your name with the question unless you give me specific permission to do so. And again, we're going to do our best to answer your questions in the time allotted. We have a little bit less than an hour, so I believe we can probably get to all of the questions that are in there now. So now our first question is about how long each agency will be involved in this response to Paden City. So I know that Connor discussed what the next steps were for EPA and our involvement in this summer in phase 2 and perhaps beyond, but I'd like to hear from the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources and the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection how long they plan to be involved in this site. So first we'll hear from Meredith from DHHR.
So West Virginia DHHR has been granted primacy to enforce the Safe Drinking Water Act. DHHR will continue to monitor the Paden City water system as required under this regulation for as long as the primacy and those regulations are in place.
Great, thank you. And now let's hear from West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection.
The West Virginia DEP will be involved with the site throughout the entire investigation and any remedial action that is required. Essentially, we'll be there as long as this is a threat to human health and environment.
Great, thank you very much. That was Casey Corbini with the DEP. So our first community question tonight is regarding the distribution of the postcard and the fact sheet that were sent out in May and June, respectively. So the postcard and the fact sheet were sent out to an area around where we are doing the investigation of the 3 different dry cleaners. So if you look back at Connor's, I'm just going to jump back here to some of this work that Connor is doing around the 3 dry cleaners. What I want to show you is that I was the one that developed the mailing list, and I basically drew a buffer as large as I could around where we're doing our activity. Because it came from EPA, it was really primarily focusing on EPA's work. So I wanted to make sure that everyone in the area was aware of EPA's work. I understand that there's quite a few people who did not receive the postcard who are outside of that immediate area, and they were frustrated by that. And for that, I think in the future, we would try to expand our mailing list so that we can get the information out to more folks. Thank you for that question. Our next question is regarding the air stripper treatment technology in place in Paden City's drinking water treatment plant. Has this air stripper ever been used in this setting before, or is this a pilot? And to that, I'm going to ask Meredith from DHHR to speak.
Yes, the air stripper technology has been determined to be the best available technology for removing volatile chemicals from drinking water. So it's the best available proven technology available.
Great, thank you. And we have another question for Meredith. Meredith noted that they didn't record anything before 2018 in terms of the PCE levels higher than 5 parts per billion. But this resident says that they have records from the Paden City Water Department from 2017 that indicate a higher result of 7.6 parts per billion. Also, this person notes that there was another result from August 2017 of 14, almost 15 parts per billion. So there's not really a question there, but I think the question is, Meredith, why was that not in your records?
Okay, so this goes back to compliance being based on a running annual average. So the running annual average is an average of samples collected from the treatment plant over a period of 4 quarters. So even though there may have been single samples above 5 prior to 2018, the sample did not exceed the 5 parts per billion on an average. Another point is to make is that the samples must be collected at the treatment plant. So samples collected at a residence or from the raw water wells do not count toward this average to determine if the system has exceeded the maximum contaminant level.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to note that we had a second note from that participant who noted that one of the readings of high PCE came from a home, from a point of use. Moving on, we have another question. This is regarding a community health survey, I believe, that's going on in Paden City. And this person lists some reports of unspecified neurological disorders, brain cancers, brain tumors, kidney issues, as well as MS. And so, Laura, this person has asked you to elaborate on the similar impacts between tetrachloroethylene and trichloroethylene. Trichloroethylene, this person suggests, has been studied to directly impact the cranial nerves, much like tetrachloroethylene. So I'm wondering if you would be able to speak a little bit about that, Laura. This person would like to know also if ATSDR takes into account the health studies done for trichloroethylene when making recommendations about tetrachloroethylene. My question is from Hannah Spencer.
Well,
Laura?
those are all good questions from Hannah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, good. Okay, I was worried you couldn't hear me. Those are all important questions. I'll try to tackle at least pieces of them. I mean, obviously, both PCE and TCE are both solvents, and they were often used in the same places so that when we have occupational studies of workers who were exposed to solvents, sometimes it was commingled, that they had both of those chemicals that they had exposure to, and we try to, we're looking at data that involves that commingled information. But there are also, a body of information, both in animals and humans, for PCE alone and TCE alone. In general, we try to focus on the chemical that is the exposure of concern at this particular location. But we did end up digging into that information that's for both of those chemicals together and trying to think about what it meant here. Just to add more complication to it, PCE breaks down and it can break down into TCE. So it is important to think about all of this together. I mean, both these chemicals have the same public drinking water standard. They have different health-based comparison values that would be used to screen whether we think health effects are likely or not. That cranial nerve impact was seen when TCE was used as an anesthetic on people at very high concentrations. That is not something that was seen with PCE. But they both have, important health effects in the neurological category. So in that sense, we are thinking about that as a category of health effects. I hope that answered at least some of that question.
Thank you, Laura. And again, Hannah, if there's anything that was unclear there, please just type it into the chat box and we can try to answer your question a little bit better. So we have the next question, also is for Laura. It's about short-term exposure to higher levels, especially in the air. So this person would like to know at what levels the vapor intrusion pathway becomes a concern. Laura?
Yeah, and that was a little bit when I was talking about pathways earlier in our meeting. It is important to think about what was brought up, that how much you've been exposed to, in what manner, whether it was drinking or by air, and for how long. All of those things weigh in together. For our comparison values for indoor air, for PCE, the no adverse effect level basis of our comparison value was around 2,000 parts per billion, or 2 parts per million. It's a place to start where we would think about that you would not see health effects at that level, but higher you might. But really, we would really want to see what any indoor air monitoring showed, and then we can go into it in more detail. I'm worried I didn't answer that one well either. I'm sorry.
You're fine. If there's anything you'd like to add, Laura, later, that's fine too. And again, the person who asked that question, if you don't feel that your question was answered, please feel free to enter anything into the chat box.
And this is a kind of an awkward format, I think we all feel, so I would be really happy to follow up individually, because these questions are really good and there's a lot we could talk about with them. So really welcome that individual conversation if we could. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I'll make sure that your contact information and all the other contacts are listed on the website and available to these folks. So thanks again, Laura. So our next question is regarding the air quality in terms of air quality inside of homes. And I think this person is getting at if they wanted to have a vapor intrusion sampling event in their home, how could they get that done and who could they contact? So you can go ahead and contact Connor O'Loughlin, our site assessment manager, if you are interested in vapor intrusion sampling in your home. Again, we're still kind of evaluating how and where we will do those samples, but it can't hurt to get in touch with us to try to see if that's something that we can do for you. So again, Connor O'Loughlin, or you can feel free to contact me, Meg Broughton, and we can work together on that. So the next question I see, is this a Superfund site? I'm actually going to ask Connor to speak to that a little bit about where we are in terms of the Superfund process.
Thanks, Meg. As of right now, the site inspection, as I discussed before, it's a limited investigation into source areas and various areas where contamination may be migrating, as well as the public wells. It's designed to, give data to what we call the hazard ranking process package, and it's a set of data that we use to determine if the MPL process and if the site is warranted to proceed to the Superfund and become an MPL site, National Priority Site. And if, in the process of collecting those data, currently the EPA conducted the phase 1 inspection, and we are proceeding into a phase 2 portion of that inspection to determine additional source locations that could be affected in those wells. And it's just the process that we use to understand if it should proceed to become a Superfund site.
Great, thank you so much, Connor. And again, the person who asked this question, feel free, if you ask any question and we respond and you don't feel that your question was answered, please feel free to type into the chat box. So the next question I have is going to go to Meredith with DHHR. Is the water safe to drink and to shower in?
So currently, the test results after they installed the new air strippers is non-detect. The treatment installed to reduce or remove the PCE in drinking water is known to be extremely effective. The system will be required to continue to monitor for drinking water at a minimum of every quarter indefinitely and report all detections in their annual consumer confidence report. You can also check with your public water system to find out answers about water quality. You can attend public meetings that involve the water system, or the city council meetings might be a good place to continue to learn more about your water system.
Thanks, and I'm going to go ahead and ask Laura to speak to the showering issue. Laura?
Yes, can you hear me again? We did actually look directly at that question about whether it was safe to shower at the highest level that was never even distributed to people. Just to be conservative and try to understand that, we have something we developed at ATSDR called a shower model that analyzed based on the concentration and how long you're showering, how much you would inhale and receive via dermal contact. And we did not see a problem even before at very high levels. So that's good news from before, and it's definitely true at what's going on now in the system.
Great, thank you very much, Laura. Okay, so we have another question regarding how the PCE contamination in Paden City has affected the soil, plant life, and wildlife. And I believe Connor will be able to speak to the soil. So Connor, go ahead.
Sure. So EPA has conducted the limited site inspection as well as the removal assessment. Speaking just to the soils, just around Bandbox Dry Cleaner, we have the majority of the results from shallow soils, but as well as subsurface soils. So that one of the subsurface samples came back with a high concentration of 1.9%, but it's 14.5 feet below ground. And that's in the immediate area around the dry cleaner. So we know that area has been impacted. Fortunately, it is covered with asphalt or roadway material, so the exposure is minimized to the public, and then there aren't any wildlife or livestock or anything like that nearby for the surface soils because it is covered. So the soils pretty much are a feeder to the groundwater. So anything that percolates through, will eventually enter the groundwater.
Thank you, Connor, for that. Our next question is regarding PCE vapor buildup in homes. What is the best way to prevent PCE vapor buildup in homes? I'm going to ask Laura to speak to that.
Well, the important thing is to ventilate. So you kind of hear that a lot even now with the pandemic about the importance of ventilation, and you can do that just by having your windows open or your garage door open. I mean, that's one way of doing that passively. If you know that you have a confirmed vapor intrusion problem and you want to invest in something they call a depressurization system, you can have a fan that actively pumps the air away from your building and out to the outdoor air. But I also know I work with some residents who have used indoor air filters. Again, it'd be good to talk if someone really thinks that they want to go any of these routes. It makes sense to think carefully, just like you would with a water treatment system, to pick the right solution for what your individual circumstances are.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. Our next question is from an individual who is wondering about, can we fix this at the source, or will we always have to depend on the scrubbers to clean our water? And I believe the answer to this will be twofold, because there is one, the water treatment piece, which I can ask Meredith to speak to again, and then the source and investigation currently, and then eventual cleanup, which I will ask Connor to speak to. So first, Meredith, can you talk a little bit on how long Paden City will depend on the air scrubber technology to clean the water?
Okay, so as long as the wells are contaminated with PCE, the air stripper will be required to remove it. The air stripper unit is considered a long-term solution, should effectively remove the PCE for this stripper unit for 20 to 30 plus years, depending on proper maintenance.
Great, thank you so much. And my understanding, though, is that, you know, you will be cleaning the water as long as contamination is an issue, because they are required by regulation to meet a certain standard. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Perfect, thank you. And then Connor, can you talk a little bit about the source investigation and eventual groundwater cleanup?
Sure. The source investigation, so the removal assessment conducted the initial phase of the source inspection is on behalf of West Virginia's request. So the initial source ends up being the bandbox dry cleaner. That's the initial source that they found. And the soil samples and groundwater samples surrounding it confirms that. So during my investigation as part of the site inspection we recently performed, we also looked at 2 additional dry cleaners as potential sources. It's unknown. We've done just very cursory look at the soils at those facilities, and during the phase 2 inspection, which will be performed next month or the month after, we'll be looking at the groundwater as well as additional soil samples surrounding those facilities. The actual sources, we're unsure if those other 2 facilities are sources, but we have confirmed bandboxes as sources. The groundwater cleanup, as I mentioned before, as part of the SI, we're collecting a limited set of data for a potential hazard ranking package and potential MPL process. And so we have to go through and collect enough data to show risk to human health and the environment. And so as part of that, it could be conducted the cleanup could be conducted in a later step as what's called a remedial investigation and a feasibility study at some point in the future to determine the best course of action to clean up that contamination.
Thank you, Connor. And again, as we're going through these questions, if you have more questions or you feel that your question was not adequately answered, please continue to use that Q&A function. And I do see questions continuing to roll in, so thank you very much for your participation. Next question, again, is going to go to Connor. Can you expand on the vapor intrusion investigation? Where and what type of samples?
Sure. So the vapor intrusion investigation, as I mentioned, was initially performed during the removal assessment. As part of EPA's process for this, leading into the site inspection, as I mentioned, we're working, removal and I are working together to analyze those areas surrounding the sources that may be potentially impacted. The expansion of the vapor intrusion investigation will occur during the phase 2 portion of our site inspection, and it will, based on what as we build on our current sets of data, we can expand to additional homes and commercial facilities nearby that may be affected. There are additional public buildings too that we can look at as well, and those types of samples, so there are three main types of samples that we end up using. So soil gas samples, which are drilled outside of buildings into the soil in people's yards or through concrete or through asphalt in front of buildings around, in areas that are tight. And so we'll use a canister to collect those samples. So all three of these are canister type of samples that we collect using a vacuum sample. We also can go into people's homes, into their basements, and take an ambient sample, just leave a canister collecting a sample over 24 hours, and come back and retrieve it and send it off to the lab. We can drill a sample in through a floor in a basement and take a sample within those soils directly below the floor, which is called a subslab sample. They're all very typical samples that are used to show risk to human health in buildings. And so those are the three main kinds of ways EPA identifies vapor intrusion.
Thanks, Connor. And I know this is, like it was mentioned before, an awkward way to talk about these things. And just know that I, as a community involvement coordinator, I'm here for you to help you understand those kinds of technologies that he's talking about. I have pictures that I can show you, and we actually have a new video that kind of explains about vapor intrusion sampling and some of the equipment that we use. So I know this is a lot of information, but just know that I'm here for you as a resource, and we will make sure that if you're interested in this, or if there is air testing going on in your home, vapor intrusion sampling, we can definitely give you some more information so you have a little bit more of an idea what to expect before that happens. Next, I will move on. We are having several questions come in about the mitigation of potentially contaminated air, contaminated vapors in people's homes. The questions are really kind of about, for private homeowners and businesses, if vapor intrusion is an issue, what is the remedy for that? What is the way to mitigate those issues? And then also, who is going to pay for that? Because I think people seem to be concerned that it would fall on the private resident, private homeowner to bear that expense. So I'm going to actually ask Connor to speak a little bit to what can be done about vapor intrusion, and then if you're able to speak about how that would be paid for.
Sure. So vapor intrusion, if it enters a home, the best way to either deal with it is to improve ventilation. So, and there are ways to do that. The direct depressurization of the subslab is one way to do that. So like a radon system can vent the gases away from the home. That's one of the ways that is used to mitigate PCE and TCE and other vapor intrusion risks. Opening windows and things like that can also help, or sealing cracks in the basement or things like that, sealing vents and making sure that the pump is full, that the sumps are fully sealed. Those are typical ways, just that are applicable. And then to pay for those costs, that's something that has to be looked at on the exact remedy, the exact financial remedy for that.
Great. Maybe, Connor, could you expand a little bit about cost recovery, what we do in the Superfund program when we have a cleanup or need to pay for mitigation? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so our cost recovery, so during the site inspection process, EPA looks for, the commercial entity, in this case, dry cleaning facilities that may have potentially contaminated their soil and groundwater, and we'll, reach out to them to discuss with them cost recovery issues And basically we either look for a facility that, in this case, the dry cleaners that may have contaminated things, and they can either pay for it. EPA can also reach out to, use our own funding to pay for it if that's the case. But EPA always tries to look for, the responsible party who did the contamination. And if none can be found, EPA will source that cleanup in a home for vapor intrusion issues.
Thank you so much, Connor. I appreciate you expanding on that a little bit. And now we have a couple of questions that I'm going to lump together. We had several folks asking about the air stripper technology in terms of the PCE removal. One, has it been used for PCE removal before? And then we had a specific question, has this model of air stripper been used in this context in a public water supplier? And I'm going to ask Meredith to speak to both of those.
Okay, so I don't know the specifics on this particular model, but air strippers have been used for PCE removal in West Virginia at other water systems, and extremely effective. It's been successful.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And then we had a question come in. I think there's some interest from the community in speaking separately with ATSDR about some of these health concerns, community health concerns that may have come up from the community health survey. One of the community members is noting that there is an abnormally high and very rare neurological disease cluster in Paden City, and also citing other issues such as ALS, brain cancer, kidney problems, etc. It seems that this health survey has been done on 300 homes so far. So again, I mean, Laura, is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of the community health survey and what they've been finding out?
No, I just want to acknowledge, I know that it's a huge amount of work to do this kind of canvassing of your fellow community members about health issues, and it's hard for everybody to learn about the amount of disease in their community. I talked about this a little bit at the start of my remarks, that our ability to draw conclusions from health outcome data, that's what we call diseases and symptoms like that, is really limited. I wish we were better at it. I wish we could give you stronger feedback about what this can mean, but we're not there yet in the kind of science that we have and the epidemiology that we have. But I do absolutely want to continue the conversation with the community members that are doing this kind of work. And I've had some conversations already, and I also saw later in the chat that how it's painful to hear me say that, given what we know, that there's all these illnesses in people's families and their neighbors, that how can I just say that we don't think that the PCE and the drinking water supply caused that? And I do really want to strongly point out that there is a lot that we don't know about what causes people's illnesses. I don't want to give a sense of certainty that we don't have, but we do our best with the information we do have, and we extrapolate from those occupational and animal studies and try to make conclusions when we can. And my agency has these what we call toxicological profiles that try to gather all in one place all that animal and human data that we have about a specific chemical. And the one for PCE is another one of the questions I'm jumping to, Meg, that was in there. How often do we update information about the hazards of a chemical? We do go back to these reviews periodically. The PCE one is actually pretty recent. It was published as an update last year, and it's 435 pages long, and it's got a lot of data that we use to try to consider what it means to have had an exposure to this chemical and your health.
Thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate that. And I definitely can hear how passionate you are about it, and I know you personally, and I know that you would be very willing to meet with these community members separately if they requested that. Okay, so moving on, we have a question about the groundwater plumes, which I'm going to ask Connor to speak to. The question is really, how long does it take to determine how large the plume is? So how long will it take for your investigation, and are there multiple plumes? How many are there?
Sure. So basically when we start looking at, as part of the site inspection, the plume, has been determined to be around bandbox cleaner and stretching. It has to be stretching all the way to the public wells. So at this point, each pumping well draws that contamination under gravity and hydrological conditions to those four, initially the 4 wells, now it's 3. So you can imagine that the material, the geological material that the chemical is flowing through is highly porous. There are lenses of, less porous material there, but it's sands and gravels as part of an alluvial aquifer system. So those chemicals, you can think of it as 4 long plumes of PCE, and they are migrating. So the deepest public well is roughly in the 90-foot range, and bandbox cleaner, if it, since it is determined to be a source due to the high concentrations there. The other 2 dry cleaners are unknown at this point. We're still conducting our investigation, but we know that the PCE plume encompasses those areas that have become affected due to the PCE contamination, which included areas near the dry cleaner. And so we're considering that those, it's roughly 63 acres of size. So if you can connect all the wells and the dry cleaner together, the plume is flowing through that zone to those wells.
Thanks very much, Connor. And it looks like I accidentally skipped a question here, and I apologize to the community member who posed it. It was a question about the cost of the vapor intrusion sampling in residential homes. So I can take this one. Just to be clear, if EPA decides to do vapor intrusion sampling inside of your home as part of our investigation, that will be no cost to you. So moving on, another question that we have, it is regarding the exposure in the shower from showering to the PCE. And the question is, at what concentration does short-term exposure become a concern in the shower? And I'm going to have Laura answer this, please.
So you can model this in different ways. You can put in a whole lot of different factors. I'll just try to answer it kind of generally, and can get into more detail in the future. But it should be, if you use a water level of 168 parts per billion, that will, I think, model out on using certain assumptions of an air level that would just hit our short-term screening level. Now, that's not a level that we would expect to see health effects, but that's where we'd start to say levels above this we should look at further. So that 168 part per billion level is a starting point for the showering. So you can see that's definitely a lot higher than what we would have seen in anybody's home.
Great, thanks, Laura. And since you're already speaking, I have another question for you regarding the vapors coming out of the air stripper. This person is wondering if the air strippers are causing the citizens of Paden City to breathe in more PCE than normal.
I can't really comment on the operation of the air stripper. I don't know if other folks on the phone understand how those work and how emissions are captured.
Okay, I apologize. That question should have gone to Meredith. Meredith?
I also do not have any knowledge of the air part of this, just the drinking water treatment.
All right, thank you. So what I'm hearing is that maybe that's a question that we need to revisit. Perhaps we can ask some other folks and come up with an answer for you, the person who asked that question. But thank you for the question, and we will take note of that. The next question I'm going to pitch to Connor. It's a question about the soil contamination near bandbox cleaner. So if the soil is contaminated with PCE for homes near bandbox cleaner, will you be doing vapor intrusion sampling in their homes?
So the answer is yes. So as part of the removal assessment, some of the higher risk zones that we determined near the cleaners itself already have been reached out to by the OSC, Dennis Matlock, and as well as the commercial space nearby. Those locations have been looked at so far, and as part of the site inspection, as I mentioned, I'll be reaching out to folks that are in the immediate area nearby or in potential zones where we determine that additional risk may be based on your direction towards those public wells or higher risk population areas that we're going to look at in the future. But as part of this site inspection, for the phase 2, we as EPA haven't counted any homes or commercial spaces out. I'm willing to work with residents to figure out where to sample, and if you feel that your home is of risk, we can discuss that. And if you are within a zone of the bandbox cleaner, I'll be reaching out to you.
Thank you very much, Connor. We had a couple of questions, actually, Connor. I believe you'll be able to answer regarding the sampling that you did near the glass company, with Mock Glass, I want to say. I probably pronounced that wrong. So we had a question: what is the purpose of testing process water? It appears that the process water was collected from the the area of the glass industry. And then, another concerned citizen is wondering if the groundwater is contaminated in association with the glass factories. Can you speak to that at all, Connor?
Sure. During the removal assessment, can you hear me? Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
So during the removal assessment, that the industrial well there was sampled. So the process water indicated, moderate to low levels of contamination within that well. And, so EPA was, as part of our site inspection and, the whole process that leads up through that, we're trying to collect as much data as we can from existing wells, that shows that well for the glass company was at the same depth as the public water, and knowing that process water is used and and disposed of, that is of interest to us as part of our full inspection process. So as part of the inspection, we're just trying to collect as much data as we can to show if there's a risk to human health and the environment.
Great, thanks. And while I have you on the line, Connor, do you have any sense of a timeline on the total investigation and possible cleanup of this situation in Paden City?
Sure. So I can speak to the site inspection. Our phase 1 site inspection began in January of this year, and our phase 1 portion finished this last month. Our phase 2 inspection will begin sometime next month and go through it as long as needed. And so that can expand into different phases. And as that process carries on, we will collect as much data as needed to determine the next process and the next step leading into, a potential listing for the MPL if that's what is determined.
Great. Thank you so much, Connor. Next, we have a question. It's okay if I read her name. She said from Robin Fox. We have heard in recent months that the state of West Virginia is considering raising the maximum contaminant level tenfold for PCE. Can you speak to that, Meredith, please?
Yeah, so this is not true for the drinking water maximum contaminant level for PCE in West Virginia. Since West Virginia has primacy to enforce the federal EPA Safe Drinking Water Act, while West Virginia can implement their own regulations and set their own limits, we are not allowed to be less stringent than the federal Safe Drinking Water Act. So we can't raise the NCL higher than what the EPA has already set.
Thank you, Meredith. We had a question about property values, homes and property values. This is a really common question that we get whenever there is any sort of environmental contamination. I personally have probably almost 30 sites around the Mid-Atlantic region, and I can't name one where I don't have folks that are concerned about home and property values. And what I always say is that we just don't have any idea at this point. We're still in the investigation phase of the extent of this contamination and the impacts. And so, of course, this is not something that we would ever wish on anyone, that it would affect their home or property values, but we just try to be transparent going forward about exactly what we know, and we don't speak to what we don't know. So thank you for that question, but unfortunately, as I said, it's a common question, but we don't typically have a straight answer for that. The next question that I'm going to pitch is to Laura. Laura stated the latest report on PCE was published last year. Who published it, and is it available to the public, Laura?
Yes, it's absolutely available to the public. The report I'm referring to is from my agency, ATSDR. So if you Google ATSDR and PCE and profile, you will get the full report. It's all online.
Thank you very much. And just a quick time check. So we are at 7:23. Unfortunately, we do have to end at 7:30. We've got a couple more questions to get to, so I'm just going to keep rolling through. But again, I just want to emphasize this is the beginning of a dialogue with the EPA and with these other agencies as well. So please don't feel that if your question was missed, that it's not going to ever be answered. Thanks again for sending in these great questions, everyone. We had a question regarding the vapor intrusion sampling. Folks are really interested in knowing basically which homes would be included in the vapor intrusion sampling. Someone asked, is it safe to say if we got a postcard, could we be affected with vapor intrusion? Unfortunately, we can't make that connection at this point. I just looked visually on a map and made, like I said, a large buffer area around the area where EPA was doing work that was not based at all on any data. It was all visual. I just wanted to make sure that if community members may see any work going on, that they knew that it was in association with the EPA. So unfortunately, we sent out 577 postcards to homes in Paden City, and I just have no way of telling you whether it could be affected by vapor intrusion. But as Connor moves through phase 2 of his assessment, then we can begin to answer questions about the vapor intrusion risk. Another question from the same community member is, how will you let us know the results of the investigation and what the remedy would be? And actually what I'm going to do is turn that back to you, because I'm very interested in what works for you in terms of communicating with the Paden City community. And I've gone ahead and added a poll to the center of the screen, which you should be able to see. Go ahead and vote if you can see that poll. What is the best way to reach you with information about the site? This helps us because we want to make sure the information is reaching you. Okay, so I guess we have some continued questions about the glass factory. And again, we're running a little low on time, but I'm going to ask Connor to speak a little bit more about the contamination coming from the glass factory. Someone wants to know if the contamination is resulting from the glass factory.
So the short answer is probably not. The well that is there, it's an industrial well, roughly to the same depth as the public wells. It just happens to be pumping water from that same aquifer. So, as I mentioned before, for the geology is highly porous material, and as contamination gets down into that area that is pumping towards those public wells, the industrial well just happens to be one of those locations where the groundwater will flow under gravity and through those porous media to that well. So it's not coming from a source soil in the glass factory. It's going from the dry cleaner to that well, and it just happened to come up as a sample result that was positive for PCE.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that clears some things up. Thanks again for participating in the poll, folks. It sounds like mailed fact sheets and postcards are probably the best way to get in touch. But based on the feedback that we got, we definitely want to expand our mailing list. All right, we just have a couple more questions we'll try to get to. I'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll close it up for tonight. Okay, sure. So the next question we have, was the processed water at WISMAC tested for other contaminants or just PCE? Is that report available or will it be made available? Connor, can you speak to that?
So as part of that glass company sampling, the PCE was reported and was used in our determination for understanding for the SI. It usually, so as part of our assessment, the analytical results are usually reported in grouping of chemicals. So yes, I don't have them in my memory right now, but they were tested for other contaminants.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and have our last question. It's coming from Robin Fox. It's going to go to Laura. She says, we are already collecting data on human health. We already have a lot and are learning more. This data must be considered and used to update information related to those hazards to help other communities to not have to go through what we are going through regarding our family's health issues. Laura, can you speak to that?
No, I'll definitely try. I want to acknowledge that when communities go through this really hard work of trying to catalog the diseases in their area, it's not the same as disease information that we're able to get from a bona fide medical record. This might be familiar to you just from talking to your neighbor or a family member. When we ask about what illness they had, my grandmother always said that she just had stomach problems, and at one point she thought it was colon cancer, and for a long time we thought that that's what she died of. And in the end we actually ended up speaking with her health professionals, and that was not what her illness was, what her cancer was at all. I mean, it's just what you might find in what we call self-reported manner. It's very different sometimes from a verified illness from a medical record, and usually to update our understanding about a chemical and its health effects, you need that very rigorous level of verified data, you're working with an academic partner or something like that to really advance that understanding for the literature, for the scientific literature. But I still think that this kind of community work that you're doing is very powerful. It can still be very useful in other ways, but it can't be quite used in the way that I think that you might want it to be. Again, and something else that we've brought up ALS in this community quite a bit, and one of the attempts that my agency is trying to do to really understand ALS better is to have that kind of medically verified registry of cases with very rigorous, equally administered surveys about each person's exposures in the past. So that's the kind of way that we can push our understanding further on the science about exposures and health effects, is things like registries like that, or scientifically conducted studies.
Thank you so much, Laura. I know these are difficult questions, and thank you to this excellent community for posing those questions. We're so happy that you gave us your time tonight and took the time to ask thoughtful questions and to listen to us. I know this isn't ideal doing it virtually, but we appreciate your patience, especially as we tried out, the new technologies tonight. Again, I want to remind you that I have an open door always, so please call, email me, and I will definitely get back to you, and we can work together with you to make sure that you have the information that you need to be informed about the Paden City PCE site. We hope you enjoyed this information session, and once it is recorded, feel free to share it with other community members that may not be aware. We'd like for this information to be shared with the entire Paden City community. As always, we are open to feedback and ways to improve our communication with this community. So this concludes our Paden City PCE online public information session. Thank you and good night.